Please welcome to Google New York, Chef Michael Anthony. So there is so much to talk about that I don't know how we're going to do this all in like 45 minutes. I mean, I really could talk to you for hours about your career. But we're going to jump back to the very beginning and start with really what drew you to cooking and food, and when did your interest in cooking start?
That's hilarious. The very beginning was throwing peas against the wall. A lot of
So you were
folks,
20, 25 when that happened?
Yeah, right. Yeah, as a kid, I was a completely finicky eater, and my parents loved cooking. Grew up in an Italian-American family, and as I couldn't have been more difficult. And it wasn't until I started traveling and probably starving along the way that I became interested in those kinds of discoveries that you make through tasting new foods and exploring new cultures. The day after I graduated from Indiana, I moved to Japan, and I was curious about discovering. I had finished a degree in French in France and kind of convinced myself, or the people around me convinced me, that since I hadn't grown up in a restaurant family, even though I had worked in restaurants in high school and college, that I had missed the boat. And at 23 years old, 24 years old, it's no point in going, even dreaming about the restaurant business. And it's kind of ironic because in the United States, that's a relatively young age for folks to commit to the restaurant business. So I moved over there, and I had one of those kind of moments where I was very alone. I mean, the culture, I was somewhat physically distanced from everyone, and I had that both awkward time in my life and really interesting freedom to make some decisions about who I am and what I want to do. And it was over there that I had a wonderful kind of variety of experiences of working in Tokyo and working in the countryside, visiting farms. And I ultimately reached out to a chef whose name is Shizuo Shima, and I went through the acting culinary critic of the International Herald Tribune, and this guy didn't know me. There was no connection. I wrote him a letter, expressed my interest, and my real goal was to go to cooking school in Japan. I fell in love with living there and thought I would stay there for much longer than I ultimately did. But in the process of kind of getting ready to commit to culinary school, I wanted some professional experience, and I found this completely inspiring chef who was iconoclastic in every way. There are very few female chefs, and even less female business owners in Japan, especially at that point in the early 90s. And it's funny because I look back on that first kind of year and a half of my culinary experience, and there almost isn't a day that I don't literally refer to the basic information that I learned in that very, very first experience. Things like a chef always thinks ahead, choose the right tool for the right job, be prepared, work clean, keep the kitchen tidy and organized in this way. And so all those kind of they seem obvious, but I had to remind myself during that experience of was this going to kill me or not? I didn't know if I would really survive that first experience. It was quite traumatic, and the chef was definitely reliving her very brutal apprenticeship. And it's really strange because it was a kitchen made of the chef and me. So there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. It was tiny. There were 20 seats. It's also funny that, kind of fast forward now, that has become, the current trend of the restaurant industry, this notion of, a well-known chef cooking for, 12, 15, 20 people at a time. It's a dream, not quite a realistic dream for most, but we've seen, some people around the world actually pull this off. And so it's funny looking back, and that being my very first experience. So I did survive, and I ultimately followed that chef's advice to go to Paris to cooking school rather than staying in Japan. She kept saying, "Listen, you're from the West. If you love Japan that much, you can come back, but go to cooking school in the West and make sure that you have a foundation to build on." And it was really great advice.
So interesting. So what was that transition like from Japan to France? from just learning under this, seems like a really amazing woman, and then transitioning into culinary school?
Physically, it was really hard. I was working 3 jobs at once in Japan, and took 2 weeks and went via Cincinnati, where my parents still lived at the time. And I was physically drained, and I think I slept for the solid 2 weeks and got myself on my feet, and then and made that move to Paris, where they have a wonderful and interesting education system. For better or for worse, there are a lot of students that kind of between the age of 14 and 16 are routed either towards an academic course of study or a vocational school. And having made that commitment, I was really lucky to be able to go to a traditional cooking school, which was a vocational school, and I was obligated to go through the same testing that all the other kids did. So these were kind of 16 to 18-year-olds that spent 2 weeks working in kitchens and then 1 week back in the classroom. And so, the cooking part was fine. I learned quickly, but, social studies, science, and writing and French was a little harder. But it worked out, and it was a wonderful way to quickly become immersed right in the network of bunch of kids getting ready for the workforce and being introduced to some of Paris's most famous restaurants, because they had such a close interaction between businesses and those professional schools. So it's really interesting to think about some of the lack of those connections that we have here. I mean, we see there's an interesting evolution in the kind of private sector of cooking schools around the country, but especially in New York City. Mm-hmm. And at Gramercy Tavern, we certainly work with a handful of those schools and very liberally welcome people into the kitchen. We have someone sitting here who experienced that firsthand. So we go out of our way to invite people who take an interest in our restaurant to show them around and start the story. So it's what fuels our business. Making sure that we're setting up a kitchen that attracts ambitious, smart, dedicated people. And I think it's probably a little bit of a downside to the European model in that we see a lot of folks that are entering into the kitchen that either are not doing it out of pure choice or are kind of falling short academically, so they get routed into that case. And it's our real advantage in the United States to see that people are choosing to do this for a living and going in with prior work experience and with sometimes with great educations. And so there's a kind of dynamic environment in our kitchens, especially in the kitchen at Gramercy Tavern, where you have, without exaggerating, I think over half of the people that are working in our kitchen today will probably go on to run their own kitchens, or, if they're lucky enough, maybe on their own businesses.
So amazing. So jumping actually to Gramercy Tavern, when you first started there, what was the most surprising discovery that you encountered, like in your early days? You were in Japan, you were in France, you were in New York, you were at Blue Hill. What was the most kind of surprising discovery?
That's interesting. So I just want to take a second. Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot. My partner and the general manager and partner of Gramercy Tavern is in the audience. And my entry into Gramercy Tavern was interesting because it was one of the best understood restaurants of all time. It was a restaurant that was beloved and kind of known far and wide. So it was the easiest and hardest job to step into. Usually kitchens are much more of kind of difficult transitions and aggressive places. And at Gramercy Tavern, it was, thanks to Kevin and Danny Meyer himself, scripted in a way that it gave me a chance to understand the business, understand the people, and then jump into whites and get busy cooking. I felt welcomed and I felt supported, and those are things that, those kinds of reassurances I don't know about other sectors, but it doesn't come often in the restaurant world. So that in that sense, I was able to jump in and start, dreaming about what I love to do, cooking, and
so cool.
and just really running with the story. I mean, the last 7 years of Gramercy Tavern has been all about the evolution of that restaurant. And from another angle, I feel completely lucky that we work with a group of people that that are intense and intensely proud of what they do, but still courageous enough to kind of turn around every day and say, I bet we could do this a little better. I mean, if Kevin pulled out his list of to-do things that is in his pocket right now, it's a mile long. And so I think that is part of the secret behind this great restaurant, is that we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary next year, next July. And yet it feels like a place that is much younger and kind of yearning to show off and to attract people's attention. Behind every group of restaurant people are, in a sense, you hear everyone say we're in this business because we love to give, and that's true. But there's also a sense of, behind every restaurant group there are a bunch of show-offs too. So in the middle of that, I think it's a yearning to, one, be recognized, and it's almost like it's a strong desire to live up to your expectations as guests in the restaurant. And when you eat at Gramercy Tavern, it's not like you're buying a ticket to a show. You're not sitting down at a table and then all of a sudden introduced to the rules that you have to play by. It's a place where, depending on any given night, you would come there for a different reason. It might be a business meeting, it might be a celebratory meal, could be just because you've heard of a new dish that we're cooking. And all of that, is understood through the dialogue with the server and contact with the managers. Danny Meyer refers to this common denominator in all of his businesses as the hug of hospitality, that sense of awareness. And Kevin is the person in our business that keeps all of that on track. It's a balancing act between the precision of the food and service and the warmth and the realness, the genuine approach. That whether it's in the front of the house that you feel directly, that direct contact, or indirectly through the gesture of cooking something that isn't just one of 40 and we don't know who it's going to. It's behind the scenes. There's an intense communication about how to really, it's about reminding ourselves that, hey, if this, it sometimes is a bit fictional because it is a big and busy restaurant. But when you're cooking a dish, you have to say, if this is for the most important person in the world for me, how am I going to do this? And then more often than not, especially for folks that end up returning to that restaurant, there is a real exchange and a very real welcome, and ultimately dishes that are prepared and cooked, with a lot of personal connection. That's a hard thing to do in a restaurant and not drive people crazy behind the scenes. I think I may do a little bit of both, but...
Totally. One thing I definitely noticed with the book is that you feel that kind of connection, and you feel this really interesting kind of dynamic that happens at Gramercy Tavern. But just kind of jumping into the book, as you said, it's approaching its 20th year, and this is the first cookbook. So why now?
Well, I should say that there are a couple of well-known books that are excellent that were written early on, although they weren't about the restaurant itself. Tom Colicchio and Claudia Fleming both did personal projects when they were chefs at the restaurant, and they're amazing books. But the story of the restaurant hadn't been told, and why now? In terms of my involvement in this, is that 7 years into the story, it took us a while to make enough recipes to fill a book. There are 125 recipes in this book. It took us a while to gel and kind of really figure out what is the evolution of this restaurant, where are we headed. So I think it took time to kind of build the critical energy behind it to all get on the same page and work on this project. And the timing of it before the 20th anniversary is just nice that it worked out that way. It gives us a real chance to kind of celebrate the restaurant and get ready to throw a great party next year.
Nice.
But we also, when we set out to do this project, we wanted to do two essential things. We wanted to translate the the beauty and the warmth that you feel at Gramercy Tavern. So when you pick up that book, whether you all might be discovering the restaurant as you are flipping through the pages, some of you may know it more intimately and have been there a lot, or even been behind the scenes. We wanted for people to, especially for people who had worked there for years and years, people who have worked there years ago, for them to recognize themselves in that book, and to recognize that that feeling that is so present in the restaurant. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that it was a great book of reference, that it's a cookbook after all, and there are 125 recipes, and you hear so often, especially from restaurant-driven books, sure, you can kind of cook from this book, and in our case, that was the hardest part of actually writing the book, is making sure those recipes were tested and true, and making sure that they were written in a language that that anyone would understand, especially my mother. Because putting a book of recipes out there that confuses people would only lead to either the book to get thrown in the corner, or for Mom to call me 10 times a day and ask me how to do that recipe, and we didn't want either of those things. So I feel really proud. Kathy Brennan was the recipe tester of the book. She's also an author of her own cookbooks, and a longtime collaborator of Dorothy Kalin's, who kind of acted as producer of this book. And this was an all-star team, so folks that have done many, many projects, come from the magazine world, and we were able to tell the story not from a normal cookbook perspective. It's so much more than just a cookbook. It's a look behind the scenes at the restaurant, and you hear the voices of the people who work there, and there are lots of essays from the key players of the restaurant, and the introduction itself is a gripping read. I mean, it acts like it's the next chapter of Danny Meyer's, his own book, Setting the Table. So I think it is a captivating book, and so much more than just a cookbook.
I definitely agree. I mean, the photos are gorgeous. These dishes are just the stunning, and it's these amazing, like, meticulous details that come through in these photos that are just so vibrant and really represents, what is put on the table at the restaurant. Something else that I thought was really interesting is that perusing the book really is like a very interesting discovery and a look behind the scenes. But what I thought was neat, something we say here at Google, there's tons of surprise and delight moments all the way through this book. It's a really it's a fun read, it's an engaging read, and the recipes are approachable. I thought it was really neat that you guys organized it by seasons, and you interspersed different stories about people at the restaurant, or even some of the suppliers or people that you work with, which is a big part of the restaurant, and the how-to tips. I mean, that is like, I made the fish that you guys how you do it, so good and so easy. It completely changed the way I make fish. It's fantastic.
Right.
But I'm really curious, how come you decided to break it up by seasons? What was the reason for organizing the information the way you did?
So it seemed like a natural. The restaurant strives to cook meals that are attached, kind of intensely attached to a particular time of year. That expresses the food philosophy at the restaurant. And so it seemed like it was a natural way to organize the thoughts in the book as well. Gramercy Tavern has this instinctual pull, especially this time of year, when the weather gets a little bit cooler and you walk through our neighborhood and you smell that wood burning fire, right where it's coming from, whether it's the warm welcome from the people that work there, or the dark wood that makes up the decor. The tavern concept itself is just, it feels perfect for a fall meal, and we've worked super hard over the last few years to try to create that same pull for different moments of the year. So when the weather warms up and you feel that first warm air, and you're kind of craving some delicate vegetables that are carefully cooked, like, that should be a place that you feel drawn to. And the summertime, when it's so sticky and hot, you can't really even imagine how to work up an appetite that you would feel compelled to want to come to taste a light piece of fish that's grilled and served with a chilled garnish that ultimately seems manageable at that the most oppressive time of summer, or any time of the year really, because Food, I feel like food is anchored in our memory within a context. And as we, use ingredients that are grown close to home, it certainly is a real passion of mine, and we share it as a common language throughout the restaurant. We're telling a story of what is distinctive about eating here. When I say here, I mean loosely the Northeast, but sometimes we look at it very specifically, New York, and specifically at Gramercy Tavern. What's different about eating in this place than eating in San Francisco or London, Paris, Tokyo? If we were cooking in any of those places, we would attempt to do the same things, but we would be doing it with different ingredients, a different rhythm of the meal, maybe even a completely different setting. It's one of the amazing things about Gramercy Tavern is within one restaurant, you can sit in the front room, the tavern, and experience a completely spontaneous and ultra casual relaxed environment and order from an a la carte menu and pick and choose. And I love it when people will start with drinks and just ease their way into it. Turns into a meal as they're kind of grazing through the things we make. We get stronger and stronger as we break out of the mold of just creating appetizers and entrees, because I think we see that that's the way people enjoy eating today. In the main dining room, it's a bit more of a refined experience, and it's far from pretentious, but the rhythm of that meal is a little different. There are white tablecloths, and there are several extra ways in which we interact with the table through different specialized servers, and the order of the food and the offerings are different. There are vegetable tasting menu and seasonal tasting menus offered in that room, as well as a beautiful prefix menu. So, the point is that what we have to kind of search, really, it's this question of who are we, and what is it that we're trying to say that's unique about this place. And if we nail that through dishes that are, I'll say simple, but please no one laugh, because every single chef you ever hear talk about their food says, yeah, my food's simple. And especially in the context of a cookbook, everyone just sits back and says, yeah, right. And I'll recognize that we try to approach food from an unmanipulated point of view. But when I say simple, I mean we're attempting to make it memorable. So relatively unmanipulated, as few ingredients as possible to get a solid point across, and so that when you walk away from the table, you have this indelible mark. This idea of smoked trout with onions, and that dish that if there were one more ingredient taken away from that dish, it wouldn't be a dish at all. It would just be a piece of fish or a study of an onion or something. And so when we're courageous enough to kind of try to refine it to that point, I think we hit these moments where the dish is clearly understood and remembered well. It's really connected to our region because we're cooking with ingredients that are grown close to home. And then lastly, there's just some intent, a little hook, some sort of intrigue that comes in the dish that is not exactly what you expected. It's never meant to shock, surprise, never really meant to be a complete unexpected idea or ingredient, but there's always has to be something that holds your attention. If we're able to continue to do that in a way that you perceive it as a value, then my guess is you'd probably come back to try something else in the restaurant. If we can do that and at the same time make you feel like we're on your side, and truly express that in a genuine way, well then that's when I think we start these relationships that last for years and years. And Gramercy Tavern has a group of followers that is just, it's unbelievable. There's a connection between guests, employees, and this restaurant that it's extraordinary, very out of the ordinary.
So kind of touching on that, and also the passion that you so clearly have, which is awesome. As Googlers, we're very passionate people. You are really passionate about using ingredients that can be traced back to their sources and create ties between the restaurant and like the local farmers. But how do you connect that passion with then the staff and the customers? Like how does that transcend and express itself in the restaurant?
Well, everyone who works at Gramercy Tavern are the kind of people that you'd love to sit down and have a meal with, because they're in it because they're passionate about the subject. And it does describe the food philosophy at the restaurant, but the goal is not to try to create some sort of mantra. It's not a list of of good items and bad items. It definitely has a point of view, and interestingly enough, working in the restaurant business, there are so many interesting ways in which we can see how our work impacts the community. So all of those subjects come into play as we share information about how the food is produced, offer some of the excitement that we learn along the way about the people who grow that food, share in our stories of the commitment that's involved in traveling to understand how those ingredients are made, where they're made, how they connect with our story. So it's really all about now the ability to share that information, and less about, well, it's not at all about telling people how they should eat. It's simply saying, this is it's a bit of an invitation, and this happens on a daily basis at the restaurant. It was hopefully loud and clear in the cookbook that it's not like if you can't find this particular bean from this particular farmer, then don't bother doing the recipe. It's more like, I love using these kinds of beans because they taste amazing, but this is a dish about beans, and whatever beans you have, if there are no beans at all, then find another vegetable that you like, that you have, that's available from wherever it comes from, and try it out. Right? If we're doing anything right at the restaurant and through the cookbook now, it's sharing enthusiasm to cook. We've seen that now more than ever, there is an American fascination with food that we didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. But if it remains a spectator sport, we're not moving forward. And there'll be a very recognizable limit to that food movement. So one of our main goals is to help people through this book to cook more intuitively, to read the book, be excited about the idea, close it, and give it a shot. I know that's a hard thing to say, depending on your experience level in the kitchen. So we did write these recipes so that you can follow them literally and feel accomplished. I mean, the last thing that we would want for people to do is, feel lousy because it couldn't quite, do it. But I also didn't want for people to feel like they had to single-handedly replicate dishes that have an entire professional team, working incredible hours to pull them off.
In our giant New York kitchens too.
So that was a big concern. I also cook this way. I cook with the same approach and same philosophy at home when I'm alone in the kitchen. And I have 3 daughters. We love to eat together at home. My brother and sister-in-law are winemakers and passionate eaters. My wife is an artist and loves to eat. And so I cook using the same approach at home, but whereas the restaurant might require 4 or 5 people and a bunch of pots and pans and full-time dishwashers, that's not going to happen at home. And I have to figure out how to make those dishes and translate them into using 2 pans, 3 pans, and it has to happen in 40, 45 minutes, or those kids are not going to wait. So that was the work behind the cookbook, and a relatively easy step to take.
So interesting. So one of my favorite discoveries in this book, even there's again tons of surprise and delight moments, is that right after the intro, it opens with cocktails. As a cocktail enthusiast, I was so excited to see it open with cocktails, and it closes with a chocolate bread pudding recipe. And to me, that was right, there's so many more amazing things in the middle, but I'm like, cocktails, chocolate bread pudding, this is fantastic. But for you, when you were writing the book, what was your, most favorite discovery when you were writing it?
Well, we wanted to hit on, by telling the story of the origin and conception of the restaurant, we wanted to hit on so many of those firsts that were put into motion with the conception of Gramercy Tavern. And so we had a chance to celebrate the release of the book last week, and I got a chance to tell Peter Bentel, the principal architect of his firm, which has been passed on from his parents to he and his brother and their spouses. I had a chance to say thank you for creating this timeless space that could have very easily slipped into being a nostalgic representation of a New England tavern, and then would have been fixed in time and ultimately, maybe even impossibly, able to move forward. And instead what they did was they took the essence of a New England tavern and Danny Meyer's idea of what a casual American restaurant could actually become, and then approached all sorts of artisans and craftspeople and built a gorgeous restaurant that would live with all sorts of new people coming to visit it for different reasons, and all sorts of new employees bringing fresh ideas to the table. And so it feels like an amazing opportunity and a real luxury to be able to work in a restaurant like that. If you talk about the first, if you look at Kevin, for example, his passion with beer, Gramercy Tavern was one of the first restaurants to take that step and say, not only is beer a fascinating subject, complex and interesting on its own, and fun and wonderfully representative of our casual approach to food and getting together, but it also has a place in a dining establishment where it can be looked at in as serious as a way as you might want to. Thanks to Kevin's relationship with Garrett Oliver, the brewmaster from Brooklyn Brewery, they were able to really, I think, encourage a lot of restaurants in the entire industry to look at the idea of pairing beers with food. Even if you look at the physical setup of the private dining room at Gramercy Tavern, it's a beautiful 20-seat room that is prime real estate in the restaurant. It's located just steps outside of the kitchen, which before that was not really the case. Independent restaurants didn't think about using space in those terms, and it continues to be not only an amazing income-generating device for the restaurant, but a chance to welcome people to enjoy the best of the restaurant, not the coldest, most distant version of the restaurant, but the best of the restaurant in a very personal and sometimes very private environment. So the list is actually endless of firsts that happen at that restaurant, and so that makes up a big part of the excitement of the book.
So neat. So transitioning a bit into kind of the restaurant and where we are these days. It's been around for almost 20 years, so was around before the digital boom, and Gramercy Tavern actually on Google has over 5,000 user reviews, which is amazing. And I'm wondering, how has social media and the increase in user-based reviews changed the dining experience or shifted the restaurant?
Well, the impact has been profound, and I think if you look back just a little bit before the current wave of user reviews and the climate that we're in now, if we look at the origin of services like OpenTable, which were looked at from maybe even Danny himself with a little bit of suspicion early on, would that act of shifting some of the intimate contact with guests, from a personal conversation to to a little bit less personal environment where people are making their own reservations and ultimately reviewing the restaurants, leaving their comments, would that really be appropriate for a restaurant company like Danny's? And ultimately, I think we have seen with the entire industry that now has become almost a foundation that we're built on, and maybe even time to revisit how those services are organized and run. But there was a profound change, and I see it as the exchange of information that is fueling the American restaurant industry. So with the transfer of information from diner, from chef or from restaurant through the diners, and then throughout the public, we have a sense of freedom when it comes to eating, and we're not bound by rules, some traditional rules that have guided other, dining traditions around the world. I'm thinking of Europe and Asia. We're much quicker to either disregard those rules or make up our own, and I think that is an interesting thing that's happening. And we're at a period now in American cooking where those rules that we're creating, these shared techniques and And we're seeing it from a couple of very distinctive spectrums. Some chefs and restaurants are focusing on the story of the ingredients and the locality of it. Others are focusing on the alchemy and the manipulation of it. All is good, and we need for people to break down barriers in all directions to be able to let those ideas come to fruition. And so I think that it really is the exchange of information. We've seen for the first time that it is imperative for chefs to be able to communicate in our kitchen, as well as have the physical stamina and the assertiveness to exist in a stress-filled, pressure-filled environment. We're a great kitchen because we have a room full of people that know how to communicate with each other in a constructive and critical way, without having the excesses that are famous for our business, and that are kind of somewhat sensationalized on TV right now. But you have to know that any of the restaurants that cook quality foods that you love, whether they're big or small, are bound on smart people that are really setting up creative and dynamic environments.
And with that, and this community that is created in the restaurant, because there really is like a sense of community, how do you feel when people are on their phones photographing food, tweeting stuff out? They're sitting across from each other. Nobody's looking at each other. They're just both looking down. I mean, how do you handle that? Do you just keep going with the business, or are you like...
Well, I've learned how to snap pictures and send off things. I'm kind of half joking because Leah Herman from our PR marketing department and I have had so many conversations about how we share our story. And like most chefs, maybe I'm revealing my age at this point, but like through this experience, there was suspicion and a little bit of resistance to the idea of the experience of eating being delayed or distracted by the need to share. And at this point, I have always looked at it as a form of flattery. If someone would be willing to take time and share something we've made with their friends, family, or the world, then I couldn't be more thrilled. The biggest challenge for me is to follow through and be actively engaged in that process. I am very single-minded when it comes to eating, and so I actually think it's a wonderful thing. I don't have a problem with it when it happens in a restaurant. I mean, obviously we are very well of the etiquette that exists in restaurants, but I don't know. I feel like that it has fueled that exchange of information, and it is all good. I mean, there is nothing that I could say that would slow that down, and even if I were resistant to a critical comment online, I mean, we know from our from every angle, any business that receives critical comments, it's another chance to reach out and ask questions and learn from it. I mean, it's one of the aspects of our restaurant that's exceptional and challenging. When it does happen, when there's a critical comment, it's an opportunity, not a problem in and of itself.
And sometimes, it's an extension, not necessarily the criticism, but it's taking, that sense of community, and it's building community almost online as well. So I think that's something really interesting for a restaurant that's so rooted in community. That's an iconic New York restaurant that has, such a strong presence online. I mean, 5,000 reviews is pretty impressive. And I scrolled through quite a few, and there were like love, 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 all the way down.
Good.
So, yes, you're commenting.
The restaurant has a wide fan base. I mean, it's 20 years into it, and a large restaurant in terms of volume. The tavern room is open 7 days a week without interruption, from noon straight through until 11, 12 on a couple of nights. So that's a lot of folks that we get to see throughout the year. So it's
so neat. So in the book you talk a lot about community, and now there's we've talked about it online, a bit offline in the restaurant. And about how you work to kind of have a community spirit. And I'm curious about how you're involved in the community outside of Gramercy Tavern, because I know you're quite active. So if you can talk a bit about that, it'd be great.
So the idea of community is, I think, a core and foundational idea in all of Danny Meyer's restaurants. It has, it's very evident to look at how that started with Union Square Cafe and see the growth of the Union Square area with and around that restaurant. I think that Danny transformed the industry in a lot of ways through that belief of a business having that kind of social responsibility to interact with within its community. We've seen the benefits, the economic benefits from that. There's another great example if you look at the way in which Danny reached out to non-for-profit organizations and changed the way the two can help each other and carved out brand new territory. At Gramercy Tavern, we've looked to build on that that tradition with a couple of things in mind. Generally speaking, we've looked at how one of the very important and attractive ways to see our business is that we are essentially educators. I grew up in a family, my mom and dad were teachers, and so it has kind of been a through line throughout all the restaurants I've worked in. Being a dad and having 3 kids, I think carefully about how they eat and how I introduce food to them. And restaurants, especially chefs, are funny in that you'd think that we eat really well, but restaurant people are notorious for skipping meals and leading strained lives outside of the restaurant because it takes such a commitment. And so I've thought long and hard about how we interact with our community. And using the theme of education, we've reached out, for example, to a local elementary school, PS 41, which is in the West Village. When a parent walked by in my first year of working at the restaurant and said, "Can my kid's first grade class come and visit?" I said yes. And it was already something on my mind that I was looking forward to pursuing, but it just happened that one day that she showed up, and I said, let's sit down and talk about how we could do that. And what blossomed from that is a relationship, a long-term connection to the administrators, teachers, parents, and ultimately the kids, not for once-a-year field trips. That would be nice, and it's part of the public school curriculum to introduce 6-year-olds to the world around them. They visit fire departments and police stations and libraries. A restaurant would sure be a nice addition to that, but what we set out to do was not just add another field trip, but it was to create a dialogue. And if we were going to spend that kind of time with something that's outside of the immediate function of the restaurant, then we wanted to have something to show for it. We wanted to share some ideas and see people run with them. We had a decision to make which school would be appropriate, and PS 41 fell geographically in a perfect situation because we could get to the restaurant to interact with we could get to the school to interact with the kids, we could get them to the restaurant for hands-on cooking activities, and we could meet them at the market so we could talk about food. And that wasn't to bombard them with propaganda. It was just to say, hey, look, this is part of our lives. We treat this market as something really precious. We want to show you. And we've seen in the last few years a real uptick in the number of schools that are doing that, the number of people that are introduced to shopping at the Green Market. So it's a nice byproduct that we would be opening a window on, the story of where food comes from. But to look at it from the other angle is that the restaurant industry has a wide cross-section of people that come to work in it. Now it's one of the largest employers in the entire state. So we have folks that are on their way to writing their book and landing a role in the next show, and maybe on their way to law school, or their families are certainly asking them when are they going to do something important with their lives, something real. And through this interaction with the community, we are able to kind of add value to the idea of working in a restaurant. We are not just a service-based industry. We're a key component in the community that we're involved in, and we get to see that appreciation from all those people that I named. And so that's one of the most immediate ways that our staff gets to appreciate what all our hard work is about. It's about opening windows and opening doors on a new way to look at food and a new way to make food a priority in our lives. We have a number of other organizations that we admire and that we expend an enormous amount of creative energy working with. Share Our Strength is one of them that is a long-running tradition within the Union Square Hospitality Group. God's Love We Deliver is another organization that we've been spending a lot of creative time thinking about how to interact with them. The point is that we want to find organizations that we're aligned with, that we feel like we have common goals and that we can add to their story. So that, again, it's not a once-a-year gala event or us bringing a dish to serve at their tasting, but it's about thinking about how can our organizations interact and do something that is really interesting and betters not only both organizations but the people that ultimately are surrounded by those organizations.
It's a true iconic community restaurant. Who knew that those words would go together? We're going to be wrapping up in just a couple minutes with the interview portion, but if anybody has questions, I'll ask you to go to the mics now. We'll have a couple minutes at the end for some Q&A. But I have to ask, what's next for Gramercy Tavern? Any new projects you can tell us about?
Well, we have a new website that we just launched this week, so if you guys haven't seen it, I hope you will check it out. We're able to tell our story in a quicker and much more efficient way, and we had a brilliant time of redesigning the site, and I think it's fun to work with, and a great kind of the design itself helps explain the duality, the dual nature of that restaurant between the tavern and the main dining room. So many people see Gramercy Tavern as a fancy, expensive restaurant, and we love it, but we can't go back until the next anniversary or birthday. And I see some smiles out there, so I hope that you all know this, and if you don't, I hope you'll experience it. Obviously, the main dining room is a wonderfully refined experience, but the tavern could not be more casual and spontaneous. So sharing that visually and through that website is one of the exciting things that we've just done. We're headed to Boulder next week to cook at Frasca Restaurant, and we have another 5 or 6 cities in the next month or two that we're going to visit to promote the book, but mostly have fun with friends around the country.
So great. First question.
Hi, thanks for coming. The book is beautiful. I haven't read the full thing yet, but I could ask you a million questions, but I think I'll just ask one. Some of the, I think you talk somewhere in the book about some of the recipes requiring a hook, and it would have never occurred to me in a million years to have spinach fettuccine in a corn soup sauce. Can you talk a little bit about the creative process? And in particular, I'm wondering if you have any stories about spectacular failures, the stuff that just didn't work.
Great question.
Sure. Thanks. So if there are any Italians in the room or Italian food purists, we're about to get an argument here. It's interesting that you found that combination that it stood out for you. I'll take it back just a step. There is a wonderful pasta program at the restaurant, and it was launched by a former sous chef who's now the executive chef and partner of Maialino Restaurant. His name's Nick Ander. When I arrived at Gramercy Tavern, I not only found a wonderfully talented cook and a natural-born leader, but this guy who was so passionate about Italian food, and through college he had studied in Italy, and Danny Meyer himself has a long history with Italy through his father's business, and Maialino itself is a play on words named after his experience of working there as a young guy. And so I think it was probably, certainly that current is alive and well through the cooking at Union Square Cafe, but I think Danny had always envisioned running an Italian trattoria, Roman-style trattoria. And when he met Nick, and when they finally set their sights on it, he found someone that knows Rome better than him, and knows Roman cooking maybe as well, if not better than him. Nick was responsible for starting this story at Gramercy Tavern of an actual pasta station, not just a prep work that belongs to one of the existing stations. It was a specialization and a commitment to hiring a full-time person that would be not just responsible for making the pastas, but responsible for studying the subject of pasta. And but it also sparked an interesting discussion because Nick, with it coming from his experience in Italy as a purist, and the way we ultimately handle pastas based on me twisting his arm at times and through our conversations is that we're an American restaurant, and our attempt is not to make a direct reference to Italian cooking. It's all about using the subject of pasta as a vehicle for seasonal flavors. And so, that is a great example. And I picked them not to thumb my nose at Nick, but to make a point of saying that there's an interesting way to look at American cooking that steps away from some of the traditions. It's not a study of the noodle. It's a collection of seasonal pleasing seasonal flavors. The other technical aspect of that pasta is that no Italian pasta would have that much sauce. And the idea is not to Frenchify the dish, but to say, I personally love eating pasta when the last bite is as moist and unctuous as the first bite. And I don't find that when I'm eating traditional Italian pasta. I love it for what it is, but my taste is a little different. And so I have the wonderful luxury of being able to pursue those ideas. And, every time we do that, I hope that you guys feel the same. So it's interesting that would be the first question that is coming my way. I'm sure it is not the last time that I'll hear questions about the way we approach pasta from that cookbook. But I think that that is the particular idea that sets that dish aside. It's relatively straightforward, but it's not quite expected. In terms of disasters, it's interesting because the kitchen at Gramercy Tavern is so big and so busy that you would think that they would unfold on a regular basis. And I think really this might be a little boring. Somebody asked me this question. There was a journalist looking for some juicy chef guy information. It's like, what do you guys do late at night when you're hanging out? Where do you go? Where's the favorite stomping grounds? What do you drink? What do you do? And I said, you're asking the wrong guy. Like, I do lines at MoMA and I do shots of chocolate milk. Like, I have no information for you. But in that vein, there are very, very few, if any, evenings, lunches, dinners, services at Gramercy Tavern where the wheels come off and you see that explosive nature behind restaurants. I've worked in a lot of restaurants like that, but it's a characteristic of our kitchen and our restaurant that it's a very poised group of people, and we really don't have time for those excesses, and they don't really exist there. Sorry, I wish I could come up with a juicier story for you.
Next time.
Yeah.
Last question.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. The food at Gramercy Tavern, as well as in the cookbook, is undeniably beautiful and has a very specific aesthetic to it. And I'm just curious what your view is on the claim that Michael Ruhlman and others have made that at the end of the day, no matter how pretty food is and no matter how interesting or refined it may be, cooking is craft and not art. I'm just curious what your view is on that.
Great subject, and I actually would just let me say a couple of words. You talked about the aesthetics of what we do. Just to give it a little sense of a timeline, I did spend a lot of time working in France, and it's funny that, for being a Francophile for all those years, I'm the guy in the kitchen that says, find an English word, don't use the French jargon, or let's not make reference to a particular Italian style of cooking. Let's do it in a way that feels natural to us, and that's not because we're not students of food and interested in and being thoroughly informed and committed to the craft that we practice. I see the style of food that we cook at the restaurant as an extension and as far back as I can go in terms of inspiration. And this is, kind of bound by my own study of cooking, but I see the origins of what we do as being things that that were kind of thought up and experimented with and created in like the beginning of the last century through the like country restaurants in and around Lyon in France. If you look at, for those of you who are familiar with chefs like the Trois Gros brothers and Alain Chapelle, who passed away, in his early 50s, Michel Gerard, who I had a chance to spend a summer season working for. All of these were kind of very technically trained French chefs that were cooking in rural areas. It was the history of France, right? That people would leave Paris on vacation and about a 4 or 5 hour drive south would hit those central France, and you would stop for a great meal. And French being French, they would probably end up spending 3 or 4 hours at the table. But it was the history of that country and that dining tradition. And, partly because I fell in love with those regions and I grew up cooking with those chefs, it has definitely impacted the way we cook. So every time you see this in the picture on the cover of the book, we kind of talk about that style of plating as the harmonious scatter. And I talk about it in the book, not to try to make it sound more important than it is, but it actually is an aesthetic that is meant to be intentional. We're not approaching food from the Alice Waters school of just put the food on the plate and don't move it. It's beautiful on its own. I agree with that in some cases and practice that in some cases, but the plating techniques in the restaurant are more intentional than that. At the same time, not one dish looks exactly like the next, because our intent is to cook food that tastes great and eats well, not that simply approaches consistency for consistency's sake. I think when our goal is simply consistency, it leads to mediocre results. I guess that gives a little background in terms of the style of cooking, but I will say that I agree wholeheartedly with your statement of cooking is more of a craft than it is an art. My wife is a painter, and when we have the discussion of the origin of an idea, it's ridiculous to think that a painter, in fact, it would be over the second a painter set out to create a painting for for an audience. I mean, maybe that might be some of the strangeness of the art world these days, but from a chef's perspective, it's the opposite. We are creating things that we're yearning for people to fall in love with. And along the way, I think if we're doing it well, we're expressing a personal point of view. We're also bound to the materials. At least so far, we're seeing food as almost broaching on the subject of performance art in some cases. And I'm not sure that produces the meals that I would fall most in love with, but I'm certainly interested in the subject of it. But for the most part, when we talk about cooking, I do see it much more as a craft. It's about the techniques that are used, the traditions that are passed on, the lore and the legacy of cooking. And a great meal is one that resonates deeply and makes me fall in love. So from my perspective, that is much more akin to all of the framework of what we would describe as a craft than a pure art. I mean, I see art as a boundless personal expression, and while some chefs would love to be considered artists, and I do think that in moments food can transcend those boundaries and be looked at as art, for the most part, where I see it as a craft.
I think it's both. Then it's so wonderful to have you here. I think we sold out of the books, I think, back there, but they're available online, they're available in bookstores, and it's a really fantastic book. So
can I add a shameless plug? The pre-sales of the book have been excellent, and we are feeling that the book might actually make its way to the New York Times bestseller. And so if you're contemplating, for all of you who bought the book today, thank you. The timeline runs out tomorrow night. So if you're contemplating,
show your support for the community.
Shameless.
I say go for it. And we should all buy the book. It's really fantastic. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here. And